His own brothers kidnapped him. They sent a prostitute to break his will. They kept him captive for more than a year at the top of a tower. But that young nobleman, whom they called the Dumb Ox, emerged from his prison to transform Western thought. What mystery burned in the heart of Thomas Aquinas? 13th century. Europe is burning with new ideas. Gothic cathedrals reach toward heaven like stone prayers. While in the universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, a silent war is being fought for the soul of the West, the texts of Aristotle. Lost for centuries, returned translated from Arabic and Greek, bringing questions that shake everything. Can human reason know God? Can pagan philosophy and Christian revelation work together? In this world on fire, between the mountains of Lazio, where the kingdom of Naples meets the papal states, stands the castle of Roccasecca. There, in one of Italy's most powerful families, around 1225, a boy is born. His family dreams big for him, bishop, maybe cardinal, maybe more. But God has other plans. That quiet boy, with deep eyes and endless questions, will not be a prince of the church. He will be a beggar on dusty roads, a teacher in crowded classrooms, and the architect of ideas that will light up centuries. This is the story of Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor. Roccasecca Castle watched over the valley from its rocky height. His father, Count Londolfo of Aquino, served Emperor Frederick II. That ruler the world called Stupamundi for his brilliance and his cruelty. His mother, Theodora of Chieti, came from the Norman warriors who had conquered southern Italy with swords and blood. The family was connected to Saint Gregory the Great, Saint Louis of France, and Saint Ferdinand of Castile. Heroes and saints ran in Thomas's bloodline. From his first years, he was different. While his brothers learned to fight and hunt with falcons, Thomas stayed lost in thoughts nobody understood. The servants said the boy barely cried, that his eyes looked past what everyone else could see. During a violent storm, lightning struck the castle, killing his nurse and his sister in the room where he slept. Thomas survived without a scratch. Many saw it as a sign of his future holiness. The event marked him forever. All his life, Thomas feared thunder, running to churches during storms, pressing his head against the tabernacle as if trying to get closer to the Lord. At 5 years old, following the custom of noble families, he was sent as a young monk to the Abbey of Monte Cassino. That monastery, founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia 7 centuries before on the ruins of a pagan temple, was the crown jewel of Christian monasticism. Behind its walls were treasures of wisdom, ancient manuscripts, writings of the Church Fathers, stories of saints and martyrs. The Benedictine monks welcomed the noble boy, hoping one day he would lead their community. They taught him Latin from Virgil and the Bible, Gregorian chant that lifted the soul, psalms that marked the hours of each day. But what struck those black-robed men most was the question young Thomas asked over and over with disturbing persistence. "Master, what is God?" He didn't ask who God was, like children learning catechism. He asked what God was, trying to penetrate the very heart of the mystery. The monks looked at each other. This quiet boy carried a thirst inside him that nothing on earth could satisfy. But Monte Cassino's peace wouldn't last. The war between the Pope and the Emperor turned the abbey into a battlefield. Frederick II, excommunicated by Pope Gregory IX, sent his armies against papal lands, and Monte Cassino was caught in the middle. In 1239, the abbot decided to evacuate the noble boys to protect them. Thomas, only 14 years old, was sent to the University of Naples, the school the emperor himself had founded to compete with the church schools of the north. Naples was a melting pot of cultures where Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side, where Aristotle's writings circulated in Arabic translations from scholars in Cordoba and Toledo. Young Thomas, trained in the quiet discipline of Benedictine monks, suddenly found himself drowning in an ocean of new ideas. He discovered Aristotelian logic that organized thinking like mathematics. He studied Aristotle's physics, which explained how things move and change. He read Aristotle's Metaphysics, asking about being itself, about first causes and ultimate principles of reality. It was also in Naples that Thomas met the friars of the Order of Preachers. The Dominicans had arrived in the city a few years before, setting up a convent next to the church of San Domenico Maggiore. These men were nothing like the monks of his childhood. They didn't live locked away singing prayers, but walked the streets preaching, begging for food, arguing in plazas and universities. Their founder, San Dominic de Guzman, had created the order only 2 decades before to fight heresy with words and example. The Dominicans combined the radical poverty of the first apostles with a burning love for learning. For them, knowing truth was necessary for preaching it. Thomas attended their sermons, talked with them after class, visited their simple convent where the friars slept on boards and shared everything. Something started burning inside him. The monastic life of Monte Cassino had given him peace. The Dominicans offered him fire. Around 1244, at 19 years old, Thomas Aquinas put on the white and black habit of the Order of Preachers. He didn't ask his family's permission. He knew what they'd say. The news hit Roccasecca Castle like an earthquake. Countess Theodora, that woman with Norman steel in her spine who had ruled her house with an iron hand while her husband served the emperor, couldn't believe what her messengers told her. Her youngest son, the family's hope for reaching the highest positions in the church, had given up everything to wear the habit of beggars. She got on her horse and rode to Naples with the determination of someone rescuing a son from kidnappers. But when she arrived at the convent of San Domenico Maggiore, the friars had already seen her coming. They knew well the power of noble families and the pressure they put on their sons' vocations. The Master General of the Order had decided to send Thomas north, first to Rome, then to Paris, where he'd be beyond the Aquino's reach. Theodora returned to Roccasecca empty-handed, but not defeated. Thomas's brothers, Rinaldo and Londolfo, served as officers in the imperial army operating in Tuscany. Their mother sent them an urgent message. They had to intercept the Dominican group traveling to France and bring Thomas back by force if necessary. The 2 warriors obeyed immediately. Near Aquapendant, on the path winding through the woods of southern Tuscany, imperial soldiers caught up with the friars. Thomas was ripped from his brothers in habit and carried on horseback like a war prisoner toward the family fortresses. First, they took him to Roccasecca, but fearing the Neapolitan Dominicans were too close, they decided to move him to the castle of Monte San Giovanni Campano, an isolated fortress in the mountains, where nobody could find him. There began a captivity lasting more than a year, a time of testing that would forge steel in his soul. Thomas's cell was a room at the top of a tower with a narrow window barely letting in daylight. His brothers launched a systematic attack on his will. First came the sweet talk. They reminded him of his noble bloodline, the plans the family had made for him, the glory waiting for him as abbot of Monte Cassino and future church prince. They promised him wealth, power, the ability to do good from the top of church government. When sweet talk failed, came the threats. They warned they'd cut him off, erase his name from family records, that he'd die alone and forgotten on some dusty road, begging for bread. Thomas listened in silence. His only answer was prayer. He'd asked his jailers to let him keep the Bible and the sentences of Peter Lombard, the main theology textbook of medieval times. During those months, locked away, he memorized huge chunks of scripture, meditated on the mysteries of faith. And his calling, far from weakening, grew stronger like iron in fire. Desperate at their brother's unbreakable resistance, Rinaldo and Londolfo tried something that shows how brutal that era was. One night they sent into Thomas's cell a young prostitute, beautifully dressed, with orders to seduce him. If the novice fell into sexual sin, his vocation would be ruined, his honor destroyed. And he'd have no choice but to give up his dreams of religious life and do what the family wanted. The testimonies collected during the canonization process, half a century later, describe what happened that night. Thomas, realizing the trap, stood up with terrible determination. He grabbed a burning stick from the fireplace heating the room and moved toward the woman with such a look on his face that she ran away terrified. Then, with the same smoking stick, he traced a huge cross on the stone wall and fell to his knees before it. The friars who collected his testimony years later said that on that night Thomas received a special grace. 2 angels appeared and wrapped him with a cord of perpetual chastity. From then on, according to tradition, he never again felt temptations against purity. The fire he'd used to defend his calling became a symbol of the fire burning inside him, the blazing love for God that no human power could put out. The imprisonment continued, but something started changing in the fortress of Monte San Giovanni. Thomas's younger sister, Marata, got permission to visit him. Those talks between siblings transformed the young woman. Where she expected to find a stubborn fanatic, she found a man of deep peace, brilliant mind, unconditional love even for those keeping him prisoner. Thomas held no anger toward his family. He understood they were acting according to their worldview, according to the honor and ambitions they'd inherited from generations of warriors. But he'd been called to another battle, a battle for truth fought in the silence of study and the privacy of prayer. Marata was so moved that she herself, years later, would leave the world to dedicate herself to God in a Benedictine monastery. It was maybe the first conversion done by that young man who hadn't yet preached a single sermon. Finally, around summer 1245, the family gave up. Count Londolfo had died during his son's captivity, and Theodora, maybe exhausted from fighting, maybe moved by Marata's stories, decided to free Thomas. But she didn't want to do it publicly so she wouldn't have to admit defeat to the beggar friars. According to tradition, Thomas was lowered in a basket from his tower window where the Dominicans waited to receive him. He was 20 years old, had spent more than a year locked up, but came out of that prison stronger than ever. The order's leaders, recognizing both his strength and his talent, decided to send him to study under Europe's most famous teacher. That same autumn, Thomas Aquinas took the long road to Cologne, where Albert the Great was waiting for him. Cologne, in the heart of the Rhineland, was a city of merchants and scholars, where church towers competed with cranes building a new cathedral. There, in the General School of the Dominicans, taught Friar Albert of Bolstedt, known across Europe as Albert the Great. This 60-year-old German, Friar had devoted his life to a massive project, explaining all of Aristotle's works, proving that Aristotle's philosophy, far from being faith's enemy, could become its most powerful partner. When Thomas arrived at his school in autumn 1245, he found a very different place from Naples. Here there were no street arguments or palace intrigues, but the productive silence of study, broken only by pens scratching on parchment and teachers' voices revealing the secrets of existence. Albert welcomed the young Italian with the hospitality natural to friars, but also with the sharp eye of someone who knows how to spot talent. He quickly saw that this big, quiet novice had uncommon intelligence. Thomas's classmates, though, didn't share the master's view. They saw a young man who barely spoke in academic debates, who seemed lost in his thoughts while everyone else argued passionately, who walked with slow, heavy steps like a farm ox. The nickname came with the casual cruelty of young people, the dumb ox of Sicily. They called him, mixing up his Naples origin with the nearby island. Thomas endured the mockery with the same patience he'd endured captivity. One day, a well-meaning classmate offered to explain a really hard lesson on Aristotle's logic. Thomas accepted humbly, but when the classmate got tangled in his own explanations, it was the dumb ox who made the text clear with a brilliance that left everyone stunned. The news reached Albert the Great's ears, and he put Thomas through a tough examination. What he discovered pulled from him a prophecy history would prove true. You call this young man the dumb ox, but I promise you his roar will be so loud it will fill the whole world. From that moment on, Albert took Thomas under his special wing. He gave him the job of reviewing his own writings on Aristotle, invited him to join debates meant for masters, opened to him his personal library, where manuscripts brought from Constantinople and Cordoba piled up, for years. The student absorbed everything the teacher could give him, not just philosophy and theology, but also natural sciences, astronomy, alchemy. Albert was a universal mind who saw in every creature a reflection of the Creator and passed to Thomas this sacred vision of reality. But he also taught him something more subtle and maybe more important: method. Albert had learned from the Arabs the discipline of systematic commentary, the patience to analyze each text word by word, the honesty to admit difficulties before offering solutions. Thomas would perfect this method until it became a tool of unmatched precision. In 1252, the Dominican leaders decided Thomas was ready for a bigger mission. They sent him to Paris, Christianity's intellectual capital, where the university founded a century before had become the battlefield where Christian thought's future was being decided. Paris was boiling with controversy. Secular masters, jealous of their privileges, fought to kick mendicant friars out of university positions. William of St. Amour had published a vicious attack on Dominicans and Franciscans, calling them hypocrites who pretended to be poor while grabbing power. At the same time, the Latin Averroists, led by the brilliant Siger of Brabant, were pushing interpretations of Aristotle that seemed to deny basic truths of faith, the soul's individual immortality, the world's creation in time, God's care over creatures. And from the other side, Augustinian traditionalists rejected any use of pagan philosophy as pollution of Christian thought. Thomas arrived at this minefield at only 27 years old, a junior scholar who had to defend his right to teach while defending his own order's right to exist. The first Paris years were constant intellectual combat. Thomas wrote against those who attack God's worship, a solid defense of mendicant life that answered William of St. Amour's charges point by point. He argued that voluntary poverty wasn't hypocrisy but imitation of Christ. That study fit with begging, that friars didn't destroy the university but made it better with fresh blood. Pope Alexander IV finally stepped in to support the mendicants, and in 1256 Thomas got his license to teach as regent master. He was 31 years old. Then began the most productive time of his life, to decades of crazy activity during which he'd produce a quantity of work that defies human understanding. His work method was shocking. He dictated to 3 or 4 secretaries at the same time, switching between Bible commentaries, debate questions, controversial essays, and his great theological works. The secretaries took turns to rest. Thomas seemed to need no rest. The Summa contra Gentiles was born from a practical need. Raymond of Penyafort, the elderly Dominican who'd been general of the order, worked evangelizing Muslims and Jews in Spain. He needed a handbook presenting Christian truth in a way people who didn't accept the Bible's authority could understand. Thomas answered with a masterpiece of rational defense. In the first 3 books, he proved everything natural reason can know about God, his existence, his oneness, his qualities, his care, the world's creation, the human soul's nature. Only in the 4th book did he explain the mysteries beyond reason, but not against it, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the sacraments. The work's structure itself was an argument. Christian faith doesn't fear reason, because truth can't contradict truth. But the masterpiece was still coming. In 1265, the Dominican leaders called Thomas to Rome to start a new school. There, in the convent of Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill, he began writing the SummaTheologica. First planned as a beginner's manual, the work grew until it became a cathedral of thought, matching in its mental architecture the stone cathedrals then rising in Chartres, Reims, and Amiens. Each question followed strict order. First, the objections, the strongest arguments against what he'd defend. Then, the sed contra, an authority pointing the other way. Next, the body of the article where Thomas laid out his own answer. Finally, the responses to each objection. This method, which might seem mechanical, was really an exercise in intellectual humility. Thomas took his opponent's arguments seriously, gave them their best form, and only then answered them. He wasn't looking for debate victories, but truth. The Summa tried to map everything, from God's nature down to the smallest atom, the Trinity of divine persons, the creation of visible and invisible worlds, human nature as union of body and soul, original sin and what it did to us, the grace that heals and lifts human nature, the virtues, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, Christ's person, true God and true man, the sacraments as powerful signs of grace, the last things waiting for humanity at time's end. Thomas worked on it for 8 years, producing over 3,000 articles, 1.5 million words of density and precision that still blow scholars' minds today. And yet, as we'll see, he left it unfinished, because there comes a moment when words have to stop so silence can speak. Winter 1273 found Thomas Aquinas in Naples, where he'd returned to set up a new Dominican study center. At 48 years old, the angelic doctor worked with his usual intensity, dictating the last parts of the SummaTheologica while preparing classes and handling questions coming from all over Europe. His fame had reached crazy heights. Kings and popes asked his advice. Universities competed to get him. His works were copied and spread faster than ever before. But those who knew him well noticed something different. His face, always serious, had gotten a new paleness. His ecstasies during Mass, common since his youth, had become longer and more intense. Sometimes the friars had to shake him to bring him back from those mysterious absences where his soul seemed to live in places other humans couldn't reach. On the morning of December 6, 1273, feast of Saint Nicholas, Thomas celebrated Mass in the chapel dedicated to this saint in the Dominican convent of Naples. What happened during that celebration stays wrapped in the mystery surrounding the most private meetings between God and the human soul. The friars watching saw how the priest stopped for a long time after the consecration, face covered in tears and still as a marble statue while holding the host between his hands. Time seemed frozen in that silent chapel. When Thomas finally finished the sacrifice and went to the sacristy, something fundamental had changed in him. His secretary and confessor, Friar Reginald of Piperno, companion for years, found him sitting on a bench with his eyes lost on something invisible. He insisted Thomas continue work on the Summa, which was so close to being done. Thomas's answer would echo through centuries. Reginald, I can't, because everything I've written looks like straw to me compared to what I've seen and what's been shown to me. From Seti, the angelic doctor didn't write or dictate another single line. The next months were a slow fall toward final silence. Thomas kept up his religious duties with usual punctuality. He attended choir, celebrated Mass when his strength allowed, but had quit all intellectual work. When Reginald kept insisting he pick up the pen again, Thomas repeated with gentle firmness that he couldn't, that he wasn't able anymore. His theology, that cathedral of words that had taken 8 years of his life, stopped in the middle of the treatise on penance, halfway through a question about confession. Scholars have wondered for centuries about what that mystical experience was. Was it an early glimpse of the beatific vision, knowledge poured in that went beyond anything reason can reach? Thomas never explained. We only know that the architect of Christian thought, the man who'd built Western theology's greatest structure, recognized at the end that all his words were straw before the burning reality of God's presence. It wasn't taking back his work, but crowning it. Real knowledge of God has to lead to worshipping silence. In February 1274, a summons from Pope Gregory X arrived in Naples. The Pope had called an ecumenical council in Lyon to work on reuniting with the Eastern Church. separated since the split of 1054. He needed Thomas there, whose knowledge of Greek theology and gift for synthesis could be crucial for the talk's success. Despite his obvious weakness, Thomas obeyed. He started the journey on foot, as fit a mendicant friar with Reginald and some brothers. The road to Lyon crossed the Apennines in full winter, a hard route even for healthy men. Near Terracina, while the group went around a narrow path, Thomas hit his head on the branch of a fallen tree. The accident, seemingly small, made his condition worse. He started getting fevers and lost all appetite. His companions took him to the castle of Maenza, property of his niece Francesca, married to Count Annibald of Ceccano. There he got his family's care, but everyone understood the end was coming. Thomas then asked to be moved to a monastery to die as a religious among brothers dedicated to God, the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova, a few miles from Maenza, received him with respect. The white monks, heirs of St. Bernard's reform, knew well the angelic doctor's fame. They put him in the abbot's room, the most comfortable in the monastery. But Thomas protested gently. A mendicant friar shouldn't take such nice quarters. But he was too weak to fight it. During the next days, at the monk's request, he talked about the Song of Songs, that love poem between bridegroom and bride that Christian tradition reads as the conversation between Christ and the soul, between God and his church. Those who heard these last teachings were struck by the tenderness Thomas showed talking about divine love, so different from the academic strictness of his systematic works. It was as if the theologian had given way to the mystic, as if the angelic doctor's final words were lovers' words more than philosophers' words. On March 7th, 1274, Thomas asked to receive viaticum. When the priest entered his cell carrying the Eucharist, the dying man gathered his last strength to rise and speak his confession of faith. I receive you, price of my soul's redemption, food for my journey, for whose love I've studied, stayed awake, worked, preached you, taught you. I've never knowingly said anything against you, but if I've said something through ignorance, I don't insist on my mistake. If on this sacrament or any other matter I've written something less than correct, I submit everything to the judgment of the Holy Roman Church, in whose obedience I now leave this life. These were the words of a theologian who dedicated his life to expressing divine mysteries, and who, at the end, humbly admitted that all his knowledge bowed to the authority of the Church Christ founded on Peter. He died at dawn, while the monks sang the office of Lauds. He was 49 years old. The dumb ox had finally gone silent. But his roar, as Albert the Great had prophesied, keeps echoing through the ages. 1,700 years of words, 50 years of study, 8 years building the SummaTheologica, the greatest achievement of medieval thought. And at the end, straw, all of it, straw, not because it was false, but because it was small. Because when you see God face to face, even the most brilliant human thought looks like dust in sunlight. Thomas Aquinas spent his life building bridges between faith and reason, proving you could love God with your mind as much as your heart. And when he reached the limit of what words can say, he had the humility to shut up. His example hits us today with fresh urgency. In a world drowning in noise and shallow opinions, he calls us to the patience of deep study. In an age of polarization, his method of listening to opponents first teaches us the art of real dialogue. In times of skepticism, he reminds us faith and reason aren't enemies but sisters walking together toward truth. The dumb ox keeps speaking through the centuries. His roar echoes in every seminary studying theology, in every Catholic university, in every soul seeking God with honest mind and burning heart. If Thomas's story convicted you, if the image of that young man with a burning stick defending his calling moved you, if you want to know more about the man who mapped the Christian mind, do this. Hit subscribe. We create content about saints who changed history, theology that challenges shallow faith, truth that costs something. And in the description, I've put links to books on Thomas Aquinas, the SummaTheologica, the Summa contra Gentiles, academic biographies, theological commentaries. If you want to go deeper, to really understand Thomistic thought that shaped the Christian West, to have the intellectual weapons to defend Catholic faith in the modern age, get those books. Invest in your mind. Because Thomas proved loving God with your intellect isn't optional. It's worship. March 7, Feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, Doctor of the Church. Pray for wisdom. Choose truth. Saint Thomas Aquinas, Angelic Doctor, patron of Catholic schools, pray for us.